Hello, everyone. My name is Carol. I work as a TPM on the data programs team. So yesterday at the retrievals track, I gave a talk on SP reputation working group. Ground control, which is Know Your SP, is part of that. And I talked about the rest of the reputation work that I'm doing with a bunch of amazing people at yesterday's talk, so be sure to check that out. Today, this talk will be kind of short, just an overview on what ground control is and how do we do KYSP in the context of SPADE. So the agenda, I will go over ground control. There are two components of it, the ground control checks on KYSP and the reputation service for SPADE. Then we'll dive into the architecture and future opportunities. So ground control, the KYSP part is an ongoing, there are actually a few checks. The SP location verification check is the most sophisticated, I would say. The rest are like minimum minor power on chain, these kind of stuff. But I want to talk a little bit more about the location check that we have. So we use an underlying service called Cantic. They have a bunch of nodes all over the world that can ping a certain IP address from any of the nodes they have. So we leverage this network of nodes all over the world and ping SP IDs, individual SP IDs from this network of nodes, and find the lowest latency ping. And we make this educated guess that this is where this SP ID is located. And furthermore, we also measure the average ping. If the average ping is higher than, say, 10 milliseconds, then there could be a questionable, question mark there that this SP might be using VPN. This is an issue because some SPs might want to disguise where they're located so that they can have multiple copies of the same data set with themselves to earn more block rewards. This has been an issue in the past with Slingshot, for example, that has requirements on how many copies of a certain data set can live in one continent or one country or city, for example. And right now, this ground control location verification covers all Fill Plus SPs. So all the SP IDs that we see in all the past data cap applications and state market deals, it has the full coverage of all deal-making, Fill Plus deal-making SPs. The next thing is a different component of the ground control picture. Recall that the ongoing checks, they're just a bunch of checks that are always running and checking the location of this SP, the list of SP IDs. But for SPADE, we need ground control to also match the eligibility of SPs with tenants requirements. So for this component of the ground control reputation service, we keep track of all the current eligible tenant to SP mapping. So this component, the reputation service, gets the tenant requirement. And Reba will dive more into what a tenant on SPADE means. It basically is the client coming to SPADE to store their data. So the client will come in and say, I want to store, for example, only with storage providers in North America. Or I only want to store with storage providers that have this amount of power on chain. This information is all fed into ground control, and ground control will be able to match what it knows from all the checks that it has to the eligibility list. So this is a real-time source of the eligibility because the checks are always running. So if an SP moves location, this will be automatically updated, and ground control will know that. And not only does it have ongoing updates on the results, it also needs the one-off updates whenever a new tenant or new client signs up and gives Spade, information on what kind of SPs they want to store with. Ground control will take that information in and start this new matrix of tenant and SP mapping, because this tenant might have different requirements. So those are the two components we talked about on Spade. I don't want to dive into too much detail, and this diagram is always changing as well as we are discussing the future architecture of Spade. Basically, as a tenant, you have two choices when you come into Spade. You default to go through the ground control check, which has the location check, for example, and in the future we're thinking of adding more as well, depending on what the tenant requirement is. And it also has retrieval bots, for example, to give us all this information on the eligibility of the SP. And this information gets fed to a Postgres database. That is the ground control database. It is private. It has the matrix of SP to tenant eligibility. So if a tenant has this requirement that the SP does not meet in this particular grid in the matrix, it will have the error message of why this SP didn't meet it. So, as the SP, maybe I need that information to change my operation somehow to be eligible because I want to work with this tenant. So there's most of this process should be automated. If the SP already meets all the criteria, it gets added to the eligibility list. If it doesn't, then a human needs to be in the loop. Most likely the client, the tenant, comes in and say, I will manually approve this SP even though it didn't meet this one particular criteria. Maybe that doesn't matter. It's not a deal breaker for me. So it comes in and it still approves the SP, and this SP will still be eligible. And on the far right side, you see that Spade has a copy of this ground control database as well. Why do we need this copy? It is because the SPs also need to agree to working with this tenant, right? So in the ground control, in the middle one, the ground control database, it just says the eligibility of the SP. It says this SP, according to all the criteria that the tenant has listed, fit all the criteria. But it doesn't mean that SP wants to work with this tenant. So that's why we need another database that has the SP signature of me agreeing to work with, say, Internet Archive. And that is kind of what our heads are at. We're super open to feedback. Stefan.
I like the idea that you have a separate, so you said a signature, right?
Yeah.
Can you tie that signature to a contract? And what I mean by a contract is not just a smart contract. What I mean is like just normal terms and conditions.
Yes.
Because we've talked about at some point early on, SPs also want to make sure that whatever they store is eligible data or not like child porn or anything like that, right? So is that already on the roadmap, or how are you thinking about that?
It is on the roadmap. Great question. So there is a signature component to it, and there is a normal like text storage contract component to it that is not represented here, but it's on the roadmap for sure. Andrew?
Yeah, I think my question is, coming in as a client, what's important to me is sort of determinism in getting my data on chain, right? So I would like the assurance as a client that when I go and say put this on Filecoin, it moves onto Filecoin, period, right? Hopefully quickly. And so I guess my one question is, in this, I think this flow is great and makes a lot of sense, and but there still is that storage provider opt-in, right? The signature that's saying like that is I see it from a client perspective as a risk. I never know, are some of the storage providers going to sign this opportunity or this deal or not? have you thought about what it would take to remove that step, such that, you know, if you are eligible,
Yes.
then
Great
I
question.
know you're going to take my deal. And in fact, if you qualify as eligible and you don't take my deal, or no one in the qualifying set takes my deal, there's some sort of repercussion there.
Yeah, so there's a global setting for each tenant that you can turn on auto approve. What auto approve means is that if an SP fits all your criteria and has already signed up, or we use subscribe to your contract, then you automatically approve this contract. Because the contract needs to be two ways, right? The SP says, yes, I am eligible, I sign up, and you, on your end, on the tenant end, you can automatically approve that, so you can turn that on.
And so so if the SP is eligible and the client approves the SP, then the SP takes the deal?
Yes, yes. So in this case, the client doesn't
on.
need to do the approval action, it's automatically
No, I think
approved.
there's some
There's
confusion
two
here.
different points, yeah.
Yeah, there's some confusion here. You're talking about which SP's client is saying are eligible to take my deals. To answer your question, no, no SP is forced to take a deal or is required to take a deal. The approach here is not a stick approach, like you suggested, of repercussions. If SPs don't take deals, it's an it's a carrot approach. So the clients who are interested in having their data taken by SPs should incentivize the SPs accordingly, and that's what we're seeing in the market.
Right. I guess the question is, so let's just say, hey, I'm a client. I want storage providers in North America who are willing to, you know, take data at $1.50 per TIB per month and have capacity to take this 32 gigabyte sector. You know, yeah, I guess I'm wondering about a set of criteria by which there would be no reason for them to say no, right?
Yeah. The mic.
If a client says that I'm willing to pay $1.50 a TIB, but if the market is at $2 a TIB, then the SPs won't take deals.
Right.
But that's because there is no way for, I see your point, and that's a good point, but there is no way for SP. So the policy is on the client side right now. Like there's no concept of what an SP is willing to do.
There is though, right? Because it's embedded in the SP side tooling. So for example, the people that have written the Ace of Spades tool, or people that are writing tooling that runs on the SP side to automate deal taking, they have filters. And so they could theoretically, so for example, one of the teams that I know about, they specifically have a filter on gas price. So they have a mechanism that says the moment gas ticks above some number, stop just taking deals. It doesn't matter how good the deal is. It doesn't matter who the tenant is or whether or not this is a race to the bottom. I'm not doing it right now. And when the gas drops below a certain point, they reactivate and just take whatever comes their way. So that tooling exists. We didn't write it, which is kind of awesome. It was written by a couple of members of the community that have been working with Internet Archive or DAG House or other teams like that. There's like 3 or 4-ish tools that work sort of well. We have talked about eventually wanting to fund to either improve one of them or have a new one. Angelo, or specifically Luke, I think on Angelo's team, has been thinking about picking this up in the 4th quarter, so we're talking about it right now. But the hope is effectively we can get to a point where with enough checks up front, it's just drinking from the fire hose, right? So that would be the hope. The one thing I will call out, though, is that Filecoin data onboarding is actually never deterministic. It's never like I send you this, so you should have stored it, because the problem lies with the fact that there's a sealing process. And so by default, an SP, correct me if I'm wrong, Angelo, but theoretically you can even wait 30 days later to publish the deal, unless a client says, hey, this is going to expire in some amount of time. So the max end of when you actually go through the entire pipeline is 30 days. It could happen at any point during those 30 days that the deal could be sealed and then activated on chain. And so the idea that like, oh, like my data is gone, it better be onboarded, is always like an opportunistic thing. And so then whether or not it's triggered by a client retry or triggered by an SP retry doesn't actually like functionally make like a commitment difference. And so we're optimizing for like an SP side retry.
Default boost deadline is plus 3 days, I believe. I set it to plus 1 week.
Cool.
I would also like to put an optimistic spin on this, which is I think that this is an opportunity, right, for an ISV who can fix this or solve this problem by giving guarantees to their customers. How they implement it is for them to figure it out, but I think there's like an opportunity here to build a business. So.
You can also abstract out the SP pool and pre-sign contracts with the SPs to work at a certain rate, which is what what Daghouse is testing with the implied like 48 or 72-hour commitment, and abstract that entirely from their users. So their users are told that, hey, in 3 days' time, a piece of data will end up on the Filecoin blockchain. End of story. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about ground control, or are we out of time?
We are, one question, only because Phil is climbing the stairs, because he's going next. Okay.
Who is allowed to put data in ground control database? How do we control that?
Only ground control checks. So the ongoing checks directly pipe data into the ground control database. It's completely access controlled.
So that's a centralized service, right?
It is
Yes.
centralized service.
Yeah. I think it would be really interesting to move towards on-chain credentialing someday, where you get like a nice rubber stamp that says you went through this. And so anybody in the world can then say, oh, I know that SP went through Internet Archive's version of this and what Internet Archive cares about. And because I trust Internet Archive, I care about what they do. And so what's good enough for them is good enough for me. And so I don't now have to use Spade. I don't now have to subscribe to ground control. I just know that there's some NFT-esque standard on the Filecoin network via some contract. And I can just look at the credentials that came as a result of the SPs that engage with IA, stick their IDs into a reputation database and be like, yeah, it looks good enough, and just start proposing deals.
Great. This is a good segue to my last slide, which is future opportunities. So for the ground control KYSP, the ongoing checks, we can add different tests depending on what data owners need. Once we receive more asks, we'll just add that to the list of tests that we have on ground control. And we can also have higher coverage of SPs. Right now we cover all Fill Plus. Maybe we can extend that to all of the SPs in the ecosystem. And for our ground control reputation service, the matching service, the eligibility service, we can include other metrics. So this is kind of what also Andrew was alluding to. Like we shouldn't rely on the centralized service. We can have more sources of data that we gather and to check for eligibility of SPs. So Reputation DAO currently has 100+ metrics that we collect around SP reputation. Maybe some of that could be used for Spade as well. And also, we can generalize ground control to be used for non-SP or non-Spade scenarios. After we build this, we want to build this in a modular way so that other services in the future, another deal broker, for example, can come in and ask ground control to run through its requirements and spit out the eligibility of storage providers. So those are some of the directions we can go in the next few months. Please let me know what you think. I'd love to hear feedback. You can find me @Carol on the Filecoin Slack. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.